The text starts with the Pharisees and the Herodians coming to Jesus to ask him this question: is it right to pay the imperial tax? So just so we understand what the imperial tax is, there were a number of taxes that the nation of Israel had to pay to their occupying Roman government. Some of them were property taxes, some of them were taxes on goods, but there was this one specific tax that was kind of contentious. It was the imperial tax. It was what we might call a poll tax. The idea is you get to pay a tax for the right to be occupied by the Romans, basically. Just because you exist in our nation, you have to pay this tax every year. This tax was not a large sum of money. In fact, Jesus later in the text asks for a denarius. The denarius was the tax. And a denarius was about a minimum wage earner's one-day pay. So think about it. What does a minimum wage earner earn in one day? That's how much the tax was yearly. It's not that big of a sum of money. But as you can probably intuit, this was highly symbolic, right? The Romans didn't actually need more money. What they needed was power and influence over the people they occupied. And so it was kind of like the bully who comes up to you in the cafeteria like once a week and just steals your dessert and says, I'm doing this so that I don't beat you up. It's kind of what the Romans were doing. We don't really need this money, but we just want you to know we're more powerful than you. And so obviously you can assess that this was a highly emotional issue for the nation of Israel, because they wanted to be a people who were sovereign under God, not under the Romans. And so the idea of the tax was them essentially admitting that they were occupied by the Romans. This is also an issue that wasn't just policy, it was actually practical. Because about the time Jesus was born, maybe a few years after Jesus was born, a man named Judas the Galilean, when this tax was imposed, started a rebellion in Jerusalem against the Romans. His movement was nullified by the Roman government, as you can expect. But just to give a little bit of understanding to this, I mean, this was an issue that people weren't just arguing about over dinner. People were in the streets rioting about this. And on top of this, everybody had a different opinion about the imperial tax. Well, nobody really liked it. Some people could justify it and say, well, you know, at least it allows the Romans to give us all of their benefits from being in their empire. And while others would say, no, we absolutely need to get rid of this. Maybe just to walk through a couple of those viewpoints with you, I'm going to give you some names of some groups that you've probably heard of. A couple of them show up in the text, but others in other parts of the Bible. And we'll just see kind of their viewpoint on an issue like this. So first you would have had the Pharisees. They show up in the text here. The Pharisees would have been like your typical conservative, right? So they like traditional values. They aren't exactly rebellious against the government, but they're more in favor of a smaller government, less government influence, right? That would have been the Pharisees. You also see the Herodians show up in this text. They would have been like your typical liberal. They would have been a little bit more for big government, pay a few more taxes, but government does more for us because we pay those taxes. A couple groups that don't show up in this text but are worth knowing. The Sadducees, they're going to show up next week. The Sadducees would be like your ideological liberals, so maybe we would think of them as like progressives or leftists is probably the pejorative term that most people have for them. They would have been the people who would have seen morality and everything about society as completely relative to what everybody else wanted to do. There was no absolute moral value for them. It was whatever was the popular opinion of the day, that's what they went with. Then you also had the Zealots, who would have been your alt-right or your far-right. These were gun-toting, anti-government establishment type people. They were those who would actually carry weapons in order to kill Romans if they had a chance. They hated the government and they wanted to get rid of the government. Finally, then you have the Essenes, and if you've never heard of the Essenes, that's because they were essentially your libertarians. They wanted nothing to do with anybody. They would actually just go out and live by themselves and said, whatever, you guys can have your government, we just want no part of it. And so you can imagine how each of these groups looked at this issue, right? Some would say, they can't tax us because we want to be our own nation. We want to be our own people. Some would say, well, we don't really like the tax, but, well, we get a lot of benefits from it, so we should probably pay it. Some people would say, the Romans are the best thing that happened to us. And others would say, I'd kill a Roman if I got a chance. And others would say I would have no part of it. And all of this I give you just to give you the context of this moment in time so you can realize it is almost exactly like what we are experiencing right now. Right? You have hot button issues that people are highly emotional about. In some cases, actually protesting or rioting in the streets about these issues. and everyone has a different viewpoint on it. And so just feel the tension of this moment as Jesus gets this question. You might not think the imperial tax is a big deal, but to maybe like bring this into our time, this is like somebody coming to Jesus and saying, so what do you think about abortion? Do you think Black lives matter or all lives matter? Do you think we should mandate vaccines for people to come into businesses? Do you think we should increase immigration or should we cut off immigration? And you can imagine, and maybe you really care about one of those issues. And so what I want you to do right now is see this whole conversation through the lens of whatever question it is that matters to you so much in politics. Because that same emotional level was present here when Jesus gets asked this question, should we pay the imperial tax to Caesar?